The story of the Boer Wars is a complex tapestry of ambition, conflict, and consequence, woven into the dramatic landscape of South Africa. Fought between the British Empire, the global superpower of the 19th century, and the Boers, fiercely independent farmers of Dutch descent. These two conflicts bookended the close of the Victorian era. The wars were not simple colonial skirmishes. They were brutal, modern conflicts that exposed the vulnerabilities of the British military, pioneered guerrilla warfare tactics, and tragically laid the foundations for a century of racial segregation in South Africa. The struggle was fundamentally over the control of land and the immense mineral wealth it held, particularly gold. But it was also a clash of cultures and ideologies. The relentless drive of British imperialism against the stubborn, isolationist nationalism of the Boers. The First Boer War, from 1880 to 1881, was a sharp, humiliating lesson for the British, a powerful demonstration of the Boers' martial prowess and unwavering determination. The Second Boer War, from 1899 to 1902, was a far grander, more devastating affair. A war of attrition that drew in troops from across the British Empire and left an indelible scar on the South African psyche. It was a conflict that saw the introduction of concentration camps, scorched earth policies, and a prolonged guerrilla campaign that tested the limits of British power and resolve. The legacy of these wars is profound, shaping the political and social contours of modern South Africa and serving as a grim overture to the conflicts of the 20th century. To understand the origins of the conflict, one must look back to the Great Trek of the 1830s and 1840s. Thousands of Boers, known as voortrekkers, migrated from the British-controlled Cape Colony into the interior to establish their own independent republics. They founded the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, nations built on a foundation of Calvinist faith and a fierce desire for self-determination. For decades, a tense peace existed, but the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and, crucially, vast gold deposits on the Witwatersrand in the Transvaal in 1886 shattered this fragile equilibrium. The British Empire, driven by the economic theory of mercantilism and a desire to control global trade routes, could not ignore this newfound wealth. In 1877, Britain, citing the Transvaal's financial instability and its struggles with local African tribes like the Pedi, annexed the Republic, raising the Union Jack over Pretoria. The Boers, who had fought for their independence, were deeply resentful of this high-handed imperial action. The spark for the First Boer War came in November 1880 over a tax dispute, where a farmer named Piet Bitsu Eidenhout refused to pay an illegally inflated tax. When British officials seized his wagon, 100 armed Boers reclaimed it, an open act of rebellion that quickly escalated. On December 16, 1880, the anniversary of the Voortrekker victory over the Zulus at the Battle of Blood River, the Boers declared the Transvaal's independence once more. The British, underestimating their opponents, found themselves facing a formidable foe. The Boer commandos were not a professional army. They were a citizen militia of expert marksmen and horsemen who knew the terrain intimately. They employed tactics of mobility and concealment, a stark contrast to the British Army's rigid formations and brightly colored uniforms. The war began disastrously for the British at Bronkhorstspruit, where a British column was ambushed and suffered heavy casualties within minutes. The climax of the war came on February 27, 1881, at the Battle of Majuba Hill. Major General Sir George Colley led a British force to occupy the summit overnight, believing he had secured a decisive strategic advantage. However, the Boers, under the command of Nicholas Smith, scaled the hill in the morning, using dead ground and expert marksmanship to overwhelm the exposed British defenders. The British were routed, and General Colley himself was killed, a shocking blow to British military prestige. The defeat at Majuba Hill forced the government of British Prime Minister William Gladstone to seek peace. The resulting Pretoria Convention, later revised by the London Convention of 1884, restored the Transvaal's self-government, albeit with a vague recognition of British suzerainty. The First Boer War was over, but the underlying tensions remained, a dormant volcano waiting for a new eruption. The discovery of the Witwatersrand goldfields in 1886 transformed the Transvaal from a poor, agrarian republic into the source of the world's largest gold supply. This discovery triggered a massive influx of foreign prospectors and settlers, mostly British, who were dubbed Uitlanders by the Boers. By the mid-1890s, the Uitlanders outnumbered the Boer citizens in Johannesburg and its surroundings, yet they were denied political rights, including the right to vote. President Paul Kruger's government feared that enfranchising the Uitlanders would lead to a British takeover of their republic from within. This situation created a fertile ground for British imperial ambitions, championed by figures like Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Rhodes, a mining magnate who had made his fortune in diamonds, dreamed of a British Africa from Cape to Cairo. In late 1895, Rhodes sponsored the infamous Jameson Raid, a botched attempt by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson to incite an Uitlander uprising in Johannesburg. The raid was a complete fiasco. The uprising never happened, and Jameson's force was quickly surrounded and forced to surrender by Boer commandos. The raid was a political disaster for Britain, forcing Rhodes to resign and deeply embarrassing the government. It also hardened Boer attitudes, convincing them that the British were determined to seize their country by any means necessary. The final push towards war was orchestrated by Sir Alfred Milner, the uncompromising British High Commissioner for South Africa. Milner, a fervent imperialist, believed that British supremacy in South Africa could only be achieved by crushing the Boer republics. A final, failed conference in Bloemfontein in mid-1899 saw Milner and Kruger fail to reach an agreement on the Uitlander franchise. Convinced that war was inevitable, Kruger issued an ultimatum to Britain to withdraw its troops from their borders. When Britain refused, the Second Boer War began on October 11, 1899. The war's initial phase was characterized by a swift Boer offensive into British-held territory. They laid siege to the strategic towns of Ladysmith in Natal and Mafeking and Kimberley in the Cape Colony. The British, once again caught off guard, suffered a series of humiliating defeats in a single week in December 1899, known as Black Week. At the Battle of Stormberg, a British force was routed. At Meyersfontein, the Highland Brigade was decimated by entrenched Boers, and at Colenso, General Redvers Buller's attempt to relieve Ladysmith was repulsed with heavy losses. These defeats shocked the British public and the government, revealing the serious challenge they faced. In response, Britain mounted its largest military expedition to date, sending massive reinforcements under the command of the veteran Lord Roberts and his brilliant Chief of Staff, Lord Kitchener. The second phase of the war saw this overwhelming British force go on the offensive. In early 1900, the sieges were lifted, bringing relief to the beleaguered garrisons, most famously at Mafeking, whose commander, Robert Baden-Powell, became a national hero. Lord Roberts then led his army into the Boer republics, capturing the Orange Free State's capital, Bloemfontein, in March, and the Transvaal's capital, Pretoria, in June. With their capitals taken and their conventional armies defeated, many in Britain believed the war was over. However, the Boers refused to surrender, and the conflict entered its third and most brutal phase, guerrilla warfare. Led by brilliant commanders like Christian de Wet, Louis Botha, and Jan Smuts, the Boers formed small, mobile commandos that lived off the land. They conducted daring raids on British railway lines, supply depots, and isolated garrisons, disrupting the British war machine and melting back into the vastness of the Veld. Frustrated by his inability to pin down the elusive commandos, Lord Kitchener, who took over command from Roberts, implemented a ruthless counterinsurgency strategy. He enacted a scorched earth policy, systematically burning Boer farms, destroying crops, and confiscating livestock to deny the guerrillas food and support. To house the displaced Boer families and prevent them from aiding the commandos, the British established a network of concentration camps. The conditions in these camps were horrific. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food and medical supplies led to rampant disease. Over 26,000 Boer women and children, and at least 20,000 black Africans held in separate camps, died from malnutrition and disease, a tragedy that left a deep legacy of bitterness. The plight of the camp inmates was exposed by activists like Emily Hobhouse, whose reports shocked the British public and led to reforms, but not before immense suffering had occurred. Kitchener also constructed a vast network of over 8,000 fortified blockhouses connected by barbed wire to restrict the commandos' movement. Gradually, the relentless British pressure and the devastation of their homeland wore down the Boer resistance. By 1902, the Boer leaders recognized that they could not continue the fight without inflicting even greater suffering on their people. Peace negotiations began, culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging on May 31st, 1902. The treaty officially ended the war, with the Boers accepting British sovereignty in exchange for a promise of eventual self-government. The British were victorious, but the war had been the longest, most expensive, and most humiliating conflict since the Napoleonic Wars. It exposed severe deficiencies in the British Army, leading to significant military reforms in the years before World War I. In the aftermath, the British pursued a policy of reconciliation with the Boers, aiming to build a unified white-ruled South Africa. This policy led to the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. However, this reconciliation was achieved at the expense of the black African majority. The Treaty of Vereeniging deliberately postponed the question of political rights for black Africans, effectively ensuring that the new state would be controlled by its white minority. The Boer Wars, therefore, were not just a struggle for South Africa between Britain and Boer. They were a pivotal moment that determined the fate of all its peoples, a conflict whose echoes still resonate in the nation's ongoing journey towards equality and justice.